Hi there. This will be our second lecture for our course in social inequality. This lecture will be turning the focus towards inequality in higher education and specifically with a focus on San Francisco State and the CSU system at large. So I'm going to again go to screen share mode and pull up the PowerPoints. Okay, so the themes of this second lecture will be examining these broader trends of growing social inequality as they're evident at San Francisco State, the CSU system, and the decline of public universities across the United States. This second lecture is going to connect disinvestment from public universities with a key concept in our class, which is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a key concept for understanding rising social inequalities since the 1970s. We'll get more into the concept of neoliberalism when we look, especially at the second film called The Shock Doctrine, and some of the ideas around the globalization of inequality. That term neoliberalism will become even more to the forefront. But here we kind of introduce it here to understand what's going on with public higher education. The basic conclusion that we'll be drawing is that students' learning conditions and teachers' working conditions have both eroded, declined in the neoliberal university. That's why, we see this person here holding a sign that is something that we say all the time as teachers and as members of our union. That teachers' working conditions are student learning conditions, that they're intimately connected with one another, and they've both been being, kind of chipped away at over the decades. And the people who've been hurt by this the most have been working class students of color. They have been hit hardest by disinvestment from public universities. And so, lecture number two will continue this kind of intersectional approach that we were talking about in the first lecture, as far as looking at the intersection between class inequalities and racial inequalities, specifically in this context of higher education. So this was not always the case. If we go back to 1960, when the CSU system was first designed by the state of California, the CSU was intended to be the so-called People's University. The 1960 California Master Plan for Higher Education basically set this whole vision for the UC system, the University of California, and for the CSU system, the California State University system. And the CSU system has been called the People's University, and it has lived up to that name for some time. It did. In 1960, the California Master Plan for Higher Education established this framework for educating unprecedented numbers of students who were entering college in the 1960s. And this was partly a result of demographics. The post-war baby boom that happened, like right after World War II, where we see a huge spike in the number of children being born. That created an unusually large generation of young people, the people that we call to this day baby boomers. And at the same time that we have this large generation of baby boomers, there was also an economic shift that was happening after World War II that was placing more value on knowledge and information. We're kind of moving from an economy of production and manufacturing and more towards an economy of service, information, and knowledge. And so higher education was seen as crucial for training this workforce in the post-war years, this baby boom generation. So in 1960, the prevailing belief was that the state of California would excel and prosper if people of all backgrounds, regardless of their economic means, had an opportunity to get a college degree. And so that was the sort of the premise, the foundation on which the CSU system was built. The idea of that higher education should be accessible to all peoples. This was part of a sort of larger national context in which the ideal of equal access to higher education was becoming a reality after World War II, with the GI Bill, which basically allowed veterans gave veterans money to go back to school after having fought in the war. And also the context of the civil rights movement, which was all about sort of opening doors and expanding opportunities for people of color. And higher education was sort of seen as one of the fruits of that struggle. So higher education was really a crucial component of this thing that Robert Reich talked about in the first film, this period of the great prosperity between the 1940s and the 1970s, really hinged upon the idea that everyone should have access to a college education. This idea, roughly between the 1940s and the 1970s that we've talked about in the last lecture, this idea of the great prosperity, kind of depended on the idea of equal access and opportunity to higher education. At the same time that was happening, there was also this context of the Cold War and with Russia. And so in the late 1950s, we get this thing called the National Defense Education Act of 1958 that aimed to improve the educational system, basically to keep up with the Soviet Union, to keep up with Russia during the Cold War. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, a satellite into space. And so it was seen that like the Soviet Union was like winning the space race. You see here this headline from the New York Times from that day, and this caused a certain like anxiety and even panic in the United States that we were like kind of losing out on the space race. And so what we needed to do was invest money into higher education, especially around the sciences and engineering, but, in kind of all fields. And so the National Defense Higher Education Act injected about $1 billion of federal funding into all facets of higher education. So the colleges and universities across the country got a huge boost of money because higher education was starting to be seen as like a national security issue, something that the U.S. had to do in order to keep up in the Cold War. So within this context, the master plan of California that's created in 1960, as I talked about in the last slide, this establishes the idea that higher education should not just be available to everyone, but that it should be free. This quote here from the master plan says, "The long established principle that state colleges and the University of California shall be tuition free to all residents of the state." So the CSU and the UC system were intended originally to be free to residents of the state. And it was not only in California, this was also in New York and Illinois and other states that were, that sort of promised that these colleges and universities would be tuition free to residents. As we all know, this is no longer the case and has long since been betrayed. And we'll be looking in this lecture for the reasons why that is, why that we have broken this promise as a society for this promise for free college and university education. So what we look at today, when we look at the sort of the landscape of colleges and universities across the country, we see that tuition has in fact skyrocketed at all levels of higher education, even in the CSU system. We see that students are graduating with much greater levels of debt. Today, the amount of student loans that people hold in the United States is somewhere around 1.75 or 1.8 trillion dollars. That number is steadily increasing all the time. And so we have, this nearly $2 trillion in debt that college graduates have taken on, in large part because society has abdicated its responsibility for educating people and has kind of passed those costs on to the students themselves, has made it incumbent for the students to go into debt in order to finance their future, in higher education. Along with this, faculty salaries have declined. The whole system of tenure that held together the faculty in higher education has been being chipped away at, and colleges and universities therefore rely more on part-time, temporary, so-called adjunct faculty, of which I am one. I am a non-tenured track faculty at San Francisco State, even though I've been here for 8 years now. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, a little bit about my own personal circumstances and also like this kind of system at large and how it came to be that actually now the majority of college classes are taught by people like me who have no real job security, who are kind of like hired semester by semester or year by year on this kind of temporary provisional basis, that's often part-time and always more lower paid. So we're going to, in order to try to understand why these trends have happened, we're going to introduce now this concept of neoliberalism, which I said will be really an important part of the whole class, the whole semester. We'll get even deeper into it with this film, The Shock Doctrine. But it's an important part of the story about what happened to this, ideal of the, master plan for higher education that was tuition free. Where did that vision go from the 1960s? How did we get to where we are today? Neoliberalism is a concept that kind of helps to connect the dots. The reversal of American society's commitment to public higher education began in the 1970s and 80s. And the 1970s and 80s, as we will see, were really the pivotal decades for the formation of this thing called neoliberalism, this ideology, this way of restructuring institutions that we call neoliberalism. Neoliberalism basically calls for minimal government regulation or interference in the free market. Neoliberals advocate for a kind of minimization of social welfare, public education, and government programs. In a word, it means austerity for working class and poor people. And so it's a kind of a pullback from the social programs that we saw that were instituted after World War II. It's a pullback from these policies and programs that were intended to pick people up from, as we talked about last time, for example, the war on poverty. It's especially this idea that we should just have a completely like market-based economy, and that markets and corporations and companies should have as few regulations as possible, and that our commitment to social welfare, education, health, government programs, things that are designed to alleviate poverty, that safety net should be minimized. And these are precisely the changes that have happened, especially since like the Reagan era of the 1980s. Neoliberalism in higher education has meant running the university, quote, like a business. And that is to say, kind of squeezing workers, the teachers, and squeezing consumers, the students, while enriching, a wealthy elite. And in higher education, it means that teachers are employed more in this kind of like gig work model of contingent labor. So I often say that people like myself who are lecturer faculty, that we're like the Uber drivers of the university. We're kind of like, hired and fired as needed. We're kind of like immediately disposable. And we're kind of working according to this gig work model. And this gig work model was worked out in universities long before there was anything like, Uber or DoorDash or, any of these other kind of gig work jobs that we see today. This was worked out in higher education decades before. And my, kind of lesson to people, or, the thing that I try to remind people when I tell them that is that like if they can make professors into gig workers, they can do it to anybody. They have kind of deprofessionalized the professors, the professoriate, and if they can do that, if they can deprofessionalize us in the university, then they can kind of deprofessionalize anything. The liberalism in neoliberalism, it's important not to get confused with this. The liberalism in the name neoliberalism refers to like classical economic thought, like the ideas of Adam Smith, for example. And so in that sense, it's more akin to what is today called libertarianism, this sort of minimal government role in society, rather than modern day liberalism. So it's important to, although they're related, to not get these things confused. And so when you see the word or hear the word neoliberalism, to think more in terms of what people today call like libertarianism. Um, so the consequences for this, we can, go a little bit deeper into, again, the amount of student debt is shown here on the left-hand side. You see how dramatically this has happened. It has quadrupled in just this period of 15 years that is represented on this graph. So in 2006, the amount of student debt was a mere $481 billion, whereas by 2021, it had become 1.75 trillion, and it continues to increase from there. So there's this huge kind of bubble of student loan debt that one day is going to burst. It's just kind of completely unsustainable to have that amount of money, and the rate at which it has increased is totally unsustainable. On the right side, we see how much tuition costs went up in the California state system. The real takeoff here is around the recession of 2009. You see that the amount of tuition that students were paying in the CSU system really spiked after about 2005. Um, it was pretty steady there through the 1970s and 80s, even into the 1990s. We were still talking about, maybe $2,000 of tuition and fees. And then it really spikes going into the 2000s, and again around the time of the economic recession around 2008, 2009. And these trends are basically mirrored across the country, at colleges and state universities, in every state of the union. We see this kind of dramatic increase. And so these two graphs are kind of related, right? Like basically, the students have to pay more in tuition and fees, and so they're taking out more loans. And it's kind of like I said in the beginning, our society has abdicated the responsibility for educating great numbers of people, and passed those costs on to the students themselves. Whereas earlier there was this idea that, like, if everyone in our society was, educated or had a higher education, that that we would all be better off, that the society in general and the economy in general would prosper, and therefore it was worth making that kind of an investment. And instead, what we see now is a pulling back from that ideal of access and opportunity to higher education for all people. Um, the other side of this coin, as I mentioned, is the rise of contingent and part-time adjunct labor in universities and colleges. So here we see some pretty dramatic increases in this shift in the academic workforce, the sort of the Uberification of colleges and universities, so that in 2021, something like over 2/3 of faculty held these kinds of contingent appointments, compared to less than half in 1987. Um, about half of faculty were employed part-time, compared with only a third of that in 1987, and along with that has been a decline in the amount of faculty who hold full-time tenured jobs. So again, the trend has been towards the greater use of these contingent part-time workers who are kind of like mercenaries, were like hired guns, who were hired to come in and teach, class by class, without any kind of job security, without, the moment that they don't need us, they can just kind of like let us go. They don't even have to, give us a pink slip or, severance pay or anything like that. They just like, we don't need you to teach this class anymore. And this has been the trend across colleges and universities, across all levels of institutions. That's what the figure number 2 here on the bottom kind of shows you. Whether you're talking about doctoral universities or research one universities like Stanford, or whether you're talking about community colleges, uh, the trend has been basically all the same, across all levels of higher education. So again, if you think about, how the teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions, this is why we've seen a kind of an erosion of both. In the CSU system in general, and at San Francisco State, we see a dramatic increase in the use of lecturer faculty, of this so-called adjunct labor pool, especially after around 2009. As you see, the graph here depicts, you see a sharp increase in the number of lecturers that the CSU system employs. Here at San Francisco State, lecturers make up about 60% of the faculty, although that has recently gone down, as we'll see, because so many lecturers have been laid off in the last 2 years. But still, um, the like a majority, like most of the classes that you will take at San Francisco State are taught by people like me, who are this hired guns that don't have any kind of like job security or tenure, or even the prospect of tenure, even if we've been here, like in my case, for 8 years. So the question, sort of like, how did this all happen? How did we get from, this initial master plan for higher education to, what we've got today, with students paying more in tuition and going into more debt, and universities relying more on this kind of mercenary model of contingent labor. To do this, to understand this, we kind of have to go back to the 1960s. And as with many things, as we'll see in this class, a lot of these things start with Ronald Reagan. In this case, not when Reagan was president of the United States, but rather when he was governor of California between 1966 and 1970. And those years between 1966 and 1970 is when college campuses were really at the forefront of a number of protest movements, especially protesting against the Vietnam War, and also the protest movements for civil rights and racial equality. So college campuses became kind of like these hotbeds of dissent and protest and change, in a direction that people like Ronald Reagan really didn't like. And so, as governor of California, it's Reagan who really begins to roll back this commitment to public higher education, to sort of like rethink, like, hey, do we really want to invest our resources as a society in higher education? And so one of the sort of telling signs of this is an exchange that Reagan has with his economic advisor, this guy Roger Freeman, in the this slide that you see here, who writes to Reagan that we are in danger of producing an educated proletariat. Proletariat meaning like a working class, or the proletariat is usually to just means kind of like not elite people, like common people. And he says that's dynamite in the sense that like it's explosive. Um, we have to be selective on who we allow to go through higher education. So, you know, in the beginning of the decade, they, were like, oh, well, we want this educated proletariat because we think that they'll contribute to the workforce and will benefit from having an educated working class because, we're developing this new economy based on, services and information and knowledge. And by the end of the 1960s, when students are, protesting against the Vietnam War and they're protesting against racial inequality, they're like, hey, wait a minute. Maybe we don't want like an educated working class. Maybe, as it says here, we need to be selective about who we allow to go through higher education. And this has been kind of the push and the pull kind of ever since. And we see it now with the protests around Gaza on college campuses in the last couple of years, where, the sort of the elites like, Reagan and his friends are kind of like, rethinking their commitment to higher education because they see that it's kind of breeding like critical thought that is then challenging the empire and the sort of the whole like capitalist system in the United States. And so this is something that is kind of threatening to them. So Reagan also, says that this is why colleges like San Francisco State needed to start charging tuition. As it says here in the quote on this slide, we need to start charging tuition in order to get rid of the undesirables. Those, as Reagan says, those who are there to carry signs and not to study might think twice to carry picket signs. So this is like kind of the beginning of a deliberate attempt to kind of to make universities more kind of like exclusive and to roll back the commitment to a public higher education model that had been outlined at the beginning of the 1960s. So universities had become and colleges had become sources of dissent in these times in the late 1960s and early 70s. What's pictured here, for example, is at UC Berkeley. You may recognize the tower there in the background. This is the National Guard dropping tear gas on student protesters in 1969 on the UC Berkeley campus. And so Berkeley was perhaps the most famous place where these kinds of protests and conflicts with the National Guard happened. But by no means was it the only place. This was something that was happening not just in the United States, but around the world. As it says here in the slide, in 1968, students in many parts of the world, whether you're talking about students in Mexico City, students in Paris, in Tokyo, in Berlin, in Rio de Janeiro, all participated in massive major protests Often they were sort of galvanized by opposition to the United States war in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia more generally. But they're also were protesting their own kind of local circumstances and their own local sort of social conditions, um, in addition or alongside the protests against U.S. imperialism. So uh, college campuses became, as the previous slide said, became like dynamite. They became potentially explosive hotbeds of dissent and rebellion and protest and opposition. This in the United States, this peaks in the year 1970 during the Nixon administration's illegal bombing of Cambodia and Laos, which basically like expanded the Vietnam War. Um, and so when Nixon went on TV and announced that the United States was doing this, it huge floods of students went out and protested, and that led to violence committed by the National Guard and local police on many different campuses. In Ohio, very dramatically, where 4 students were shot and killed on their campus by the Ohio National Guard, and it made sort of like world headlines, and became the topic of songs and popular culture. It became this real kind of galvanizing point, that the killing of 4 students at Kent State. And also at Jackson State, which is a historically black college in Jackson, Mississippi, where the local police fired into a dorm room, where during sort of a protest kind of situation, and killed students there. That made less national headlines because it was a historically black college. But nevertheless, that too became a point for galvanizing students. I mean, students are now at this point like being killed on their campus, you know? And so, in response to that, in May 1970, there's this massive national strike of students and also faculty who supported them, but something like 4 million students, over 4 million students, which was half of the students' population, participated in these strikes, along with 350,000 faculty members. They shut down over 400 colleges and universities that spring. So there were no final exams, there were no graduation ceremonies, there was this kind of nationwide strike of students and faculty. Um, and so it really, what that was really kind of the peak, the apex of this kind of movement. At San Francisco State, of course, we had the very famous strike that began in 1968 and continued into 1969. This is the largest strike by faculty or by students and faculty in the history of the United States. This is the longest campus strike, longest strike on a higher education campus. It lasted 133 days total. It was started by a coalition of the Black Student Union and a multiracial alliance that called itself the Third World Liberation Front. And these students, kind of what they saw that they all had in common was that in some ways the people that the communities that they're part of had in one way or another been, victimized by American imperialism. So we're talking about, Filipino students and Chinese students and, students from a variety of different backgrounds. Certainly, like indigenous students on the campus also played a major role in this movement. And so it was this kind of coalition that came together on the campus of San Francisco State, and their demands were for more admissions for students of color, more faculty, more diversity in terms of the faculty hiring, and an educational curriculum that was more relevant to their communities, histories, and cultures. And so out of this comes the first ethnic studies program in the United States. This was one of the things that the strikers won. The ethnic studies program at San Francisco State is the first in the history of the country. And it was the direct result of this strike. The strike had been called initially because, like, San Francisco State fired a black professor of English on the grounds that he was connected with the Black Panther Party. And that's what kind of sparked this initial uprising. And what students were really kind of demanding was for a more relevant education, an education that was more relevant to their communities, to their histories, to their cultures, and that wasn't reflected at the time in the curriculum of the university. And so they didn't, kind of see themselves or hear themselves represented in what was being taught in their classes. And that was really the main point of contention. And that's why, the ethnic studies program was such a important fruit of that victory. Um, Across the country, this colleges and universities continue to be this kind of hotbed of dissent going into the 1970s and 80s. So even after the United States has withdrawn from Vietnam and sort of the end of the Vietnam War era, um, college students still continue to be an important voice in protesting against South African apartheid, as we see here um, in this slide. Students were a major reason why the apartheid system in South Africa was eventually kind of dismantled and broken down. Students were also a major voice of opposition to the Reagan administration's covert wars in Central America, in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala during the 1980s. And so again, the conservatives and the ruling class elites, they don't like this. They don't like that this is happening, and so they begin to sort of like scale back and rethink the whole commitment to public higher education. Um, so while on the one hand, these elites recognize that they benefit from having an educated workforce, and they benefit from like the forms of innovation and like technological development and research, and all of those things ultimately benefit like corporations and the powerful and the wealthy. Um, on the other hand, though, student dissent had become a real political problem for maintaining social order and for maintaining, the agenda that the elites and the big corporations and the people that sort of run the society that they were trying to enact. The student protest had become like a real problem from their perspective. So we see these two kinds of things again in constant tension, and I would say that they're still in tension to this day. So a good book for kind of thinking about this is there's a number of texts that lend insight into this issue, but I recommend this book called Unmaking the Public University by Christopher Newfield. Here, Newfield sort of tracks this defunding and privatization of public universities as part of what he calls the 40-year assault on the middle class. So again, it's connected with this, what we saw with Robert Reich, the assault on what used to be called the Great Prosperity and the decline of the middle class and the erosion of the safety net for poor and working class people. These things are all, kind of connected in a larger assault on the middle class. And so Newfield examines how conservatives and ruling class elites have maligned and restructured public universities in a campaign to end public education's democratizing influence on US society. He reveals how this assault on public universities and colleges has been fueled by politics in what was once known as the so-called culture wars against political correctness. That was the sort of the language of the 1990s, was, against political correctness. Today, of course, the language is around wokeness, and, the idea that college students are too woke, and that the curriculum is too woke. And so there's now the rhetoric has changed, but the complaint is basically the same. The complaints we start hearing about these things really go back to the 1980s and 1990s, if not even further back than that. So this whole thing about wokeness is not exactly new. Newfield also demonstrates how this political assault on public universities has been waged against race-conscious social policies, things like affirmative action, at the very same time that the demographics of student bodies have become increasingly non-white. And this is a thing that we also see with the CSU system, is that the demographics of who was going to college, particularly in terms of race, that changes dramatically in the late 20th century. And so at the very moment that more and more people of color are going to into higher education, that's when the scaling back of higher education really takes off. And Newfield suggests that this is not a coincidence. Pardon me one second. All right. So the union that represents those of us who teach on this campus and across the California state system, all 23 campuses of the CSU system, that union is called the California Faculty Association. They represent all of us who teach on any one of these 23 campuses. And in 2017, they did a report on this problem of the disinvestment in from public education, this kind of this rollback that we've been talking about between the years 1985 and 2015. And again, the report kind of reveals the very thing that I was talking about in the last slide, with the intersection between class inequalities and racial inequalities in terms of the consequences of disinvestment. And it starts with this powerful quote, I think, from the former president of the United States, Harry S. Truman, in 1947, right after the Second World War had ended. Truman says, if the ladder of educational opportunity rises high at the doors of some youth and scarcely rises at the doors of others, while at the same time formal education is made a prerequisite to occupational and social advance, then education may become the means not of eliminating race and class distinctions, but of deepening and solidifying them. And I think we've kind of gotten to that point where this quote is basically true. Instead of higher education being a door of opportunity that's accessible to everyone, and that gives everyone an equal chance of succeeding and prospering, it's become more of like a gatekeeping institution, which systematically rewards and privileges those who already have privilege and power, and it keeps out those who don't. Who weren't born with those advantages and privileges, and so it's really become this very thing that Truman warned us about back in 1947. So we can kind of dig into the numbers here, but one of the main conclusions that was drawn from this report is encapsulated in this quote here, about the demographics and the relationship between the demographics of the student body and the amount of investment from society into higher education. And the quote says, as the student body of the CSU became darker, the funding became lighter. Right? So what we see in the graph here is this reversal of the demographics of the CSU system. So as late as 1985, something like close to 2/3 of the CSU student body was identified as white. By 2015, that number was around a quarter. And the sort of pattern had reversed, so that now 62% of students identified themselves as belonging to a non-white ethnic group, whereas 26% of the students were white. And so you see here this reversal in the demographic constitution of the CSU student body. And as a result of this means that the CSU to this day is one of the most ethnically heterogeneous state higher education systems in the country, and a leader on many national measures of diversity. So of the top 20 most diverse colleges in the Western region of the US, 10 are on CSU campuses. So CSU is taking on more responsibility for educating working class students of color. And at the very moment that these demographic changes have happened, there has been this defunding and disinvestment from the CSU campuses. And basically what this is suggesting in this report is that this is not coincidental. So starting in 2009, especially around the economic recession that kind of starts in late 2007 and really hits a peak in 2008 and into 2009, the so-called Great Recession that is triggered by the housing and finance, sort of like the bubbles bursting in the mortgage market and its connection with all these forms of like financial capitalism. Um, it leads to a further like sort of cuts in the CSU system and higher tuitions, more faculty layoffs, a whole sort of uh, snowball effect of changes that happens. So this is something we'll emphasize when we look at the shock doctrine: is that like these crises, these economic crises, they start with usually like banks and financial institutions, but those aren't the people that pay for the consequences of these crises. These crises kind of roll downhill, and it's working class and poor people who had nothing to do with starting them, but they're the ones that will, pay the consequences. And so that happened here on this campus, along with so many others. And so in 2009, some students here decided to do something about it. They occupied the business building, as you see in the left hand side. They deliberately chose the business building because of this thing about neoliberalism, how the university was being run by like a business. And so, in running it like a business, they were squeezing their workers and their consumers. And so they occupied the business building in order to protest these higher tuitions and classes that were being cut. And while that's happening, the university is still funneling more money into administration. We'll come to that in a minute here. The San Francisco state occupation is part of this statewide movement of occupations that also involved the University of California campuses at Berkeley, Davis, and Santa Cruz. There were major um, occupations there. You see in the right-hand side, this is students at San Francisco State, who have gathered around the Health and Social Sciences building and the business building to kind of protect this occupation. So this involved, a good number of students, something like 700 students across the state, and including some faculty members, were arrested across campuses between late 2009 and the middle of 2011. So this was a real kind of mass movement to try to save the ideal of public higher education at the moment that it was being cut and eroding in the name of austerity and neoliberalism. Now, the curious thing, since that report that was done in 2017 by our union, the California Faculty Association, the curious thing that's happened is that there has been an injection of money into the CSU system from the state of California since about 2015. So if you see here that the amount of money that went into from the state of California into the CSU system almost doubled between 2015 and 2022. In 2015, it was $2.7 billion. In 2022, it was $5.2 billion. And you see that those numbers reflected in this graph on the right-hand side in the yellow. You see that, it really dips down pretty low in 2008, 2009, around that period. But then it begins to shoot up dramatically in this bar graph in yellow. And this is representing, again, the amount of like money that's going from the state of California. The state of California is the major, still the main source of funding for the CSU system. And you have like an extra $2.5 billion from 2015 to 2022. And so then the question there becomes like, well, okay, well then where did that money go? Because it hasn't really, it kind of obviously hasn't gone into the educational aspects of things. Where is that money now that has this huge injection of money that came from the state? And here we see the sort of the budget priorities. This is the answer to this question of like, where did this money go? Despite years of budget increases by the state, the CSU management has reduced spending on instruction while setting record high amounts spent on consultants and debt service and expanding administrative positions and pay. So you see here the yellow in this bar graph represents a decrease in the amount of money that has gone into basically like educational instruction. And the other aspects of things are all have seen steady increases, including these reserves, administration, campus police, management personnel, capital spending plan. All of these other dimensions have seen substantial increases, while instructional spending has actually continued to decline. So now we're basically coming to the conclusion that the problem is no longer simply a lack of funding from the state of California. The problem is how that money is being spent and who's making the decisions about how to spend that money and what their sort of priorities are. So, as it says, the CSU system has experienced a significant increase in state appropriations. However, this influx of funding has not translated into support for instruction. Instructional spending has declined as a share of total operating expenses, while spending on capital projects, management salaries, investments, and campus police has risen. Certainly, one aspect that has not seen much or any decline, even in bad economic times, has been the rise of managers and administration. And again, this is across the country. This is kind of an issue with like, why are colleges so expensive? Where is this money going? Well, it in part is going into hiring more administrators, not more teachers, but more, like provosts and associate deans and people that don't necessarily teach classes. I honestly am not really so sure what a lot of them do. I just know that there are substantially more of them than there used to be. So while cutting classes and raising tuition, the CSU and the San Francisco State Administration have refused to consider cutting, reducing this administrative overbloat of cutting management or executive wages and perks. So while tuition has increased and new faculty hiring has stagnated, the number of CSU managers and administrators doubled between 1993 and 2018, as you see in this graph, right? So we have twice as many of these non-instructional related administrators. We have twice as many of them as 25 years ago. The salaries of these administrators is much greater than those of the faculty. So the growth of salaries in administration and management has outpaced those of faculty. And so many of them make $200,000 a year or more. There's 10 of them on the San Francisco State campus alone, 10 administrators who make more than $200,000 a year, which is what the governor makes. That's the governor's salary. So we got like 10 administrators on this campus who are by themselves are making more than the governor. And this, really comes into focus when we think about how we see this kind of more bloated administration, but and yet like students' needs are not really being met at all. So the California State Auditor's Office did this audit of the CSU system and criticized the CSU for its high rate of growth in management compensation and the numbers of managers, which the CSU campuses have failed to justify. Growth in management pay continues to outstrip those of all other campus employees. And so the report concludes that the growth in the number and the compensation of management personnel significantly outpaced those of other employee types, including non-faculty support staff. And this really comes into focus when, in one statistic, where there is one manager for every 100 students, but one counselor for every 1,813 students. So anybody who's spent any time on this campus will tell you that like there is a real need for counseling and psychological services for students that is just simply not being met. And this was one of our demands when the union went on strike in 2024 was like, we need to hire more counselors, basically. A lot of what happens is that like students have nowhere to go, nowhere to turn to, and so then people like us, faculty, end up kind of picking up some of that slack, even though like we're not trained, to provide counseling help or anything of that matter. When students don't have anywhere else to sort of go and turn, the labor ends up kind of falling on us. And so this was like, a core demand because we care about our students and we care about their livelihood and their well-being, that, we wanted more counselors hired and fewer managers, So the problem really kind of starts at the top with these rising salaries for the CSU presidents. So this gives you an indication of how sort of like these salaries have outpaced those of people who actually teach the classes. So at the same time that they've been, crying about, there not being enough money and we need to cut and we need, austerity, we need to tighten our belts and all this kind of thing. The salaries of these chancellors and the presidents of these CSU campuses have all increased tremendously. The CSU chancellor's salary is increased by 66% to a base salary of $795,000 a year. Now that's just the base salary. They get, as it says here, $96,000 housing allowance, $80,000 in deferred compensation, a $12,000 car allowance. So the total pay package for the chancellor is close to $1 million a year. The presidents of the various CSU campuses, as you see in these graphs on the bottom, have all increased substantially. They earn as high as a $500,000 a year. Their housing allowances are in many cases greater than the annual salary of a faculty member. So they get $60,000 a year just for a housing allowance. I don't ask me why somebody who's making $500,000 a year also has to have a housing allowance of $60,000. I have no idea how they justify such a thing. Um, so then, you know, the hypocrisy is really kind of laid bare. Just a couple of years ago when they raised the tuition another 34%, because it was like, oh, we have no money and we have to tighten our belts and you know, budget deficit, blah, blah, blah. They turned around and gave themselves a raise. Like the CSU trustees awarded the campus presidents, as high as a 29% raise. And so, on average, in these 15 years of austerity, we've seen a 43% increase in what the presidential, the presidents of the various CSUs make. So you see here, San Francisco is actually at the kind of the low end. President Mahoney brings in about $400,000 a year, and that again does not include all the other kind of like perks. So the overall pay package is probably over a $500,000 a year. But again, it kind of shows you what happens when you run a university like a business. The workers, the teachers get squeezed, the consumers, the students get squeezed, and all the money gets kind of funneled up to this kind of elite, ruling class of administrators and managers and presidents and these folks that you know um, are basically the equivalent of like a CEO of a business. And so, if you're going to run a university like a business in this sense, these are some pretty predictable results, I would say. And then we have this category that is known as financial reserves. So again, while the CSU has claimed to be in a budget crisis, its financial reserves, um, it's what they call unrestricted net assets, has more than doubled in just these 10 years between 2012 and 2022. You see in this graph here a very steady and really a kind of a dramatic increase in the amount of these things that are called reserves. Reserves is kind of like not the best name for it, because you think that it's like, some sort of savings, or like, that this is the university kind of like putting money under the mattress or something. But it's really more like asset investments. And so it's tied up in all of these kind of financial instruments that are deliberately um, hard to understand, and that like require an independent kind of audit. And whenever the university, presidents are asked about these reserves and like, why can't we use them during, these emergency times? they're very unclear about where that money is, why they can't use it, what that money is for. It's all like deliberately not transparent. Um, and so what we do know is that this is basically where the money has gone. The money has not gone into instruction or paying teachers or reducing tuition. The money that has come from the state has gone into administrative salaries and into these reserves, these financial assets and investments. And again, this is something that is not unique to the CSU system. This is really something that is like a national issue and a kind of national crisis in higher education. So this is kind of takes us up to our current kind of crisis and moment. Beginning in fall 2023, San Francisco State announced a series of austerity measures which it justified and continues to justify in terms of declining student enrollments. And so this has involved the layoffs of around 325 lecturer faculty. The honest truth is like we don't know exactly how many lecturer faculty have been let go. This is kind of an estimate. And the reason that we don't know is kind of like the university like literally doesn't count us. Like we don't count to them in the sense that like they don't lay us off, they just cancel our classes and then they don't need us anymore. And so people I have known who have been in at San Francisco State for 15 or 20 or 25 years, have just lost their jobs in the last 2 years because the university just kind of like canceled their classes that they had for all that time. Um, and so 325 is just kind of like a best guesstimate and is probably on the kind of low side. We've seen the cancellation of some 655 classes. This obviously causes problems not just for people who used to teach them, but also creates problems for students who are trying to graduate on time, forces them to stay longer and pay more or to switch degrees. There's been more emphasis basically on what the administration would like to do is force the tenured and tenure track faculty to teach more classes, to teach 4 classes per semester as opposed to 3. And then they would have less need or they could get rid of lecturer faculty like myself and sort of, make us instantly disposable. And along with this, as we've seen, an increase in student fees by 34% over the next 5 years. Again, this is, kind of closing the door of opportunity that was meant to be opened by the the Master Plan for Higher Education in 1960. We've, gone a long way towards betraying that initial promise by making this university increasingly unaffordable for working people and people from working class backgrounds. So here is in the picture here we see from the strike that happened in January of 2024. Faculty were able to in that strike to win a small pay increase, but as far as these larger decisions about how the university is run and what its priorities are, those are very much in the hands of the administration, and there's not a lot that the union can do about that. As far as like these layoffs and these class cancellations and these tuition hikes, those are those are not democratically decided upon by the members of the university community. Those are decisions that are really made from on high by a highly paid administrative elite who are not really accountable or responsible for the decisions that they make. Last semester, well, no, last fall, at the end of the last fall semester, we decided to have a mock funeral to mourn the loss of these lecturer faculty who have lost their jobs at state. Um, so here you see, we got this coffin from the theater department and marched it through campus. Again, with the idea being that, like, we don't exactly know even how many people were lost their jobs, and they were just basically unceremoniously thrown away by the university without so much as a pink slip, much less a severance package or anything like that. They were just like, let go after having taught here for years and years. So we decided, if the university wasn't going to recognize them, that we would. So faculty and students got together for this march that happened on campus December 11th, 2024, where we carried this extremely heavy coffin throughout the campus. You can't see me, but I'm in the back right, holding one of the people holding up the coffin on the other side towards the back. Um, so the future of higher education looks honestly bleak. Um, from what we've presented here, um, the conclusion that we should reach, having looked at this long sort of history, is that colleges and universities are likely to continue to be these sites of social struggle, particularly as students and faculty unite to demand better learning and working conditions for higher education. So while things have been going in a pretty negative direction, we do see that people have not taken these changes lying down. That they have fought at every step of the way, and I have every reason to believe that that will continue. The neoliberal model of university education has failed both students and faculty while enriching an administrative elite. But again, people have not simply accepted these changes, but have, taken the occasion to fight for a better model of what education should be. And San Francisco State is a really important part of that because of its history, because of the student strike in 1968 and 1969. Um, it's been this place where people have demanded a relevant education, where people have put forth another idea, an alternative notion of what education should be. And I hope that, in the future, we will continue to fight for that. Um, that education is not going to be simply granted by those at the top. It has to be something that's fought for by people from below. And so it's one of the reasons I'm really proud to teach at San Francisco State. And I think it's a good indication that this is a place that's likely to be at the forefront of these struggles ahead. So I hope that that gives you a good sense of like the challenges that we're facing, some of the opportunities that may be present for change in the future, and the struggles that have occurred here in the past, and how they can continue to kind of illuminate us as we go forward into the future. So I will stop the share here, and this will be the conclusion of the second lecture. We'll go on from here to looking at theories of social inequality and material around the film The Shock Doctrine and the sort of the political economy of social inequality in our time. Okay, thank you, and see you next time.